Hello, I'm Adrian Finnegan. This is Counting the Cost on Al Jazeera, your weekly look at the world of business and economics. This week, Qatar, the world's biggest exporter of liquefied natural gas, is ramping up production. And some of the world's biggest corporate energy giants want a slice of the action. Also this week, China's internet. How does it work? And should we be paying attention to what's going on behind the Great Firewall of China? Plus, a new trading bloc is born. The EU and Japan sign a free trade deal, which will impact 30% of the global economy. Qatar is the richest country in the world if you look at GDP per capita, and it's all thanks to gas revenues. This peninsula is home to the world's third largest reserves of gas after Russia and Iran. It has 872 trillion cubic feet of it, so no surprise then that it's currently the world's #1 exporter of liquefied natural gas. Qatar supercools the gas to its liquid state, which is known in the industry as LNG. It's then shipped in tankers all around the globe. And this week, Qatar said it's planning on shipping even more gas in the years ahead. Corporate energy giants like ExxonMobil, Shell and Total are already lobbying the government to take part in the expansion. The majority of Qatar's natural gas is located offshore in the massive North Field. That field is shared with Iran, where it's known as South Pars. So lots more LNG likely to be coming from this huge gas field in the years ahead. And that's despite diplomatic tensions between the Gulf and Arab state neighbours, as Charles Stratford reports from Doha.
This is Doha then, before the building started, before its immense wealth was put to use. And this is Doha now, a striking cityscape, skyscrapers and state-of-the-art infrastructure expanding all the time. This is where that wealth comes from. Qatar is the world's largest exporter of liquefied natural gas. It currently produces around 77 million tonnes a year, and production levels are set to increase.
We will increase our LNG production capacity from 77 million tonnes per annum to 100 million tonnes per annum, which represents a 30% increase that will start 5 to 7 years from now.
The announcement comes more than a month after Saudi Arabia, Bahrain, the UAE and Egypt suspended diplomatic relations and shut land and sea borders and air travel with Qatar. Qatar Petroleum's CEO was keen to allay fears that the blockade could eventually affect the production and export of Qatar's vast gas reserves.
We're ready with all our continuity plan. We have everything in place to continue working as in normal operation, and Qatar Petroleum and all our subsidiaries for life.
Qatar exports gas to countries including Japan, India, South Korea, Spain and Poland. 1/3 of Britain's gas comes from Qatar. Qatar also exports around 2 billion cubic feet of gas a year to the UAE, one of the countries enforcing the blockade. Qatar Petroleum says this will continue. And although this is considered the worst crisis among members of the Gulf Cooperation Council in its almost 30-year history, for Qatar Petroleum, it's business as usual, with expansions on the horizon.
Well, as Charles was saying, the main market for LNG is Asia. This pie chart shows Qatar's biggest customers according to how much LNG they import. As you can see, utilities in places like South Korea and India are some of Qatar's biggest customers. They imported 11.3 and 9.9 million tonnes last year. They want to use natural gas because it's seen as a cleaner fossil fuel alternative to coal and oil. Gas from Qatar also keeps people warm in the UK in winter. According to Wood Mackenzie, that's 7.2 million tonnes and keeps them cool in the Middle East in summertime. Major buyers there include Egypt and the UAE. Japan, though, is by far Qatar's biggest customer and the world's biggest buyer of LNG. 12.2 million tonnes was shipped there in 2016 from Qatar. Joining us now from Geneva, Giacomo Luciani. Giacomo is a professor at the Graduate Institute in Geneva, where he's the co-director of the Executive Masters in Oil and Gas Leadership. Professor, welcome once again to Counting the Cost. Why is Qatar doing this? Are we going to see a battle for market dominance in the LNG market? Can Qatar, in your opinion, hang on to that coveted #1 spot?
Well, I don't think it should be phrased in terms of a battle. I think Qatar has very large reserves and wants to exploit them very simply. I don't think there is any special advantage in being number one. It's true that Qatar and Australia are neck to neck being number one, but it doesn't matter who's number one. What matters is that Qatar has large reserves and wants to exploit them.
What about the crucial supply and demand equation? Gas and oil prices have been on a downwards trajectory. Is there a danger that the LNG market could suffer from the same oversupply dynamic that we've seen in the oil market?
Well, LNG demand is growing rapidly. Supply is also growing rapidly. So it's a very difficult equation to predict. Normally, it has been said that towards 2025, that is, in the first half of the next decade, supplies of LNG might be short. And that's exactly what Qatar is banking upon, announcing a major expansion of its export capacity. They aim at coming onto the market at the moment when supply might be relatively short. But it's very difficult to predict from now until then.
You mentioned Australia. Who are the main rival producers to Qatar then? Australia's invested hundreds of billions of dollars in a bid to overtake Qatar as the world's top LNG exporter. We heard Donald Trump in Poland this week talking about ramping up US production, and he wants to sell LNG to Poland.
Yes, there are multiple projects in the United States. If all of them were to be implemented, which I believe is highly unlikely, then the United States might become a third rival in almost of the same size or even exceeding the size of Australia and Qatar. I think what needs to be said is very simple. There is an uncertainty about future demand for gas because of the global effort towards decarbonization. Some people see gas as a source that is very coherent and complementary to renewable energy sources. Other people say that no, gas has to be pushed aside like coal and oil in order to fully decarbonize. So there is an uncertainty about the future of demand. And if you sit on the largest reserves in the world, which is the case of Qatar, you want to make sure that you exploit those before demand disappears because nobody wants to buy gas any longer.
What does all of this mean for the companies involved in the production of LNG?
Well, ExxonMobil and Total have been the traditional partners of Qatar from the very beginning. They are the ones who believed in Qatar, who believed in the potential of LNG. And so it stands to reason that they will continue to invest in Qatar. It would be foolish for them to abandon Qatar or not participate in this expansion.
Can Qatar continue to supply the globe with gas if this crisis continues for the long term?
I think what we see around the world is that gas trade tends to be immune from political or security interference. In many cases, you see the same in between Russia and Ukraine, for example. They are basically at war. Nevertheless, gas continues to flow from Russia across Ukraine. So I think both sides understand that an interruption of the flows or interference with the flows would be perceived as a very significant escalation and potentially an act of war. Qatar, of course, can utilize international waters for shipping LNG to the rest of the world. And any interference with those shipping lanes would be perceived as unacceptable by everybody else in the world.
Professor, really good to talk to you on Counting the Cost. Many thanks indeed for being with us. All right, still to come on Counting the Cost, how local farmers here in Qatar are finding inventive ways to soften the impact of the blockade. But first, the world's most expensive office is Apple's new home in Cupertino, California. The brainchild of founder Steve Jobs and UK architect Norman Foster, Apple Park is a $5 billion, four-story, 2 million square foot ring. The new headquarters, nicknamed the Spaceship, even breathes via a unique system of fins and air shafts. That's because Jobs hated air conditioning. Now, at the heart of our digital economy is the memory chip or semiconductor. They're in all our smartphones, computers and data services, and the general consensus is that we're going to need even more of them in the future. Earnings guidance from the world's largest supplier of memory chips seems to validate this. South Korea's Samsung said operating profits surged to $12 billion. That's up 72% from a year earlier in the 3 months to June. That figure beating earnings predictions from any other tech company, including Apple. Now, electric cars were also a big focus this week. That's because carmaker Volvo said that from 2019, its full fleet of cars will have some kind of electric engine. So, what's the significance of this? Well, Volvo will now be in direct competition with pure-play electric car maker Tesla. Volvo is also the first traditional car maker to say that the future of automation is electric and that it would prove riskier to stick with gasoline-powered engines. Volvo's owned by Chinese company Geely, which, according to reports, is about to buy a US-based flying car startup. So let's take a look behind the Great Firewall of China. It's not a physical wall, it's a virtual barrier which filters websites, and it's how China censors the internet. Facebook, YouTube, Twitter, even Instagram are all blocked in China. The government is cracking down on online entertainment, live streaming, VPNs, and even mobile gaming. China's internet works more like a private network, except that in this case, it's a private network made up of nearly 700 million users. And that's exactly why the government in China is watching social media so closely. It wants to control the conversation, and it already has a staggering amount of data on its citizens. So big questions there regarding privacy. Nevertheless, some Western technology companies see China's internet as the future. Joining us now from Beijing is Andy Mok. Andy is the founder and managing director of Red Pagoda Resources, which invests in and provides professional services to startups in China. Andy, good to have you with us on Counting the Cost. How does China's web behind the wall work? Talk us through some of the unique features of China's internet.
It is not a completely impenetrable wall, or as people call it, the Great Firewall of China. Many people use a VPN, which stands for Virtual Private Network. And you can think of this just as a tunnel through the wall. And while this is in a legal gray area in China, it is largely tolerated by the government, even though they do have the power to shut off these VPNs at any time they'd like.
Yeah, I mean, China has been cracking down on some VPNs, live streaming, mobile gaming even, since the new cybersecurity laws came into effect in June. What does that mean, though, for Chinese internet companies operating in the domestic market?
This new cybersecurity law is part of a broader push by the government and the party to increase its ability to manage Chinese society, largely through ubiquitous surveillance, whether that is online or offline through things like facial recognition technology, integration of various data sets that will allow the government and the party to, at a more granular level, monitor and shape people's behavior. This is largely considered the largest social engineering experiment in human history.
So I want to talk about WeChat for a minute, and which can be used more or less for anything in China.
The simplest way to understand WeChat in China is that it is the remote control for your life, both online and offline. And I'll give you a quick example. It is like Amazon, Facebook, WhatsApp, and Expedia all rolled into one, in that you can buy things online, have it delivered to your door. You can buy airline tickets, train tickets. You can make investments in mutual funds. You can send money to friends. You can receive your pay, your salary on WeChat. So it literally is the remote control for your life.
So what, if anything, can Western companies learn from China's internet?
First of all, we can see now, particularly in the past US presidential election, the problem of fake news, the kind of the ease with which many people can be deceived on social media, that along with some of the unwanted types of online content, for instance, with Facebook, people live streaming suicides, murders, that now I think there's a general recognition in the US and in Europe also that a certain amount of management, or another word for management is censorship, is in fact necessary for the healthy operation of an internet. So this is an area, of course, that Chinese companies have a lot of experience in. From a technological perspective, we can see that even 3-4 years ago, most of the Chinese entrepreneurs and venture capital investors looked to Silicon Valley for the latest technology, the latest features. Now that's flipped, and we can see that Facebook recently launched its latest version that looks a lot like WeChat. So I think from a systemic management perspective, there's a lot that foreign companies and governments can learn from China. At a technical level, whether we're talking supercomputers, whether we're talking product design, I think also we've seen, I think the tipping point has been reached where a lot of foreign companies now are looking to the Chinese companies who are on the cutting edge of innovation.
Andy, really great to talk to you on Counting the Cost. Many thanks indeed for being with us.
Thank you for having me.
Now, the EU and Japan have agreed the outline of a free trade deal. It's likely to see Japan's auto industry get better access to European markets and also benefit EU farmers. Many see the agreement as a show of opposition to the protectionism of US President Donald Trump. Wayne Hay reports from Chiba in Japan.
At this stage of what is a long process, soy sauce looks nothing like the finished product. Making it the old-fashioned way requires time, patience and occasionally a bit of muscle. Like a complex trade negotiation, there are many active ingredients that are constantly at work, affecting the final outcome.
This is my life. You can never make exactly the same product, even if you make it in exactly the same way. Every time, it comes out a little different.
Now those behind this ancient craft hope new markets are about to open up thanks to the growing popularity of Japanese food in Europe. During negotiations for the Economic Partnership Agreement, the Japanese have been demanding the removal or reduction of EU import tariffs on products like soy sauce.
While the sauce has been quietly bubbling away here, in some cases for 2.5 years, the Japanese and Europeans have also been painstakingly trying to reach an agreement. More recently, things seem to have picked up pace significantly, and one possible reason for that has nothing to do with Japan or the EU. It's about what's going on in the United States.
President Donald Trump pulled the US out of the Trans-Pacific Partnership Trade Agreement, which Japan was a big part of. His trade policies are seen as protectionist and anti-globalization, and experts believe Japan and Europe want to send a message to the US.
Let's be very clear. I mean, the US is focusing on America first, and you guys do whatever it is that you want to do. The point is, in today's complex and global world, right, the incentive for corporations and for governments to have multilateral agreements, right, is very, very high.
Throughout the negotiations, there's been particular stubbornness around agriculture. Japan is keen to protect its dairy industry from a flood of European imports. The government has been reluctant to reduce tariffs on the likes of cheese imports that are as high as 30%. There have been many complexities in talks between the two parties which started more than 4 years ago. But when you're dealing with a third of the world's gross domestic product, finding the right balance to suit everyone's tastes was never going to be easy.
Joining us now, Klaus Vistas Sin. Klaus is the chief Eurozone economist with Pantheon Macroeconomics, a provider of economic intelligence and research to financial markets around the world. Klaus, good to have you with us. This free trade deal then between the two of the world's largest economies, it's been in the works for 4 years. Why has it come to fruition now?
They've tried to time it with the G20 in order to show the world, this is to say Japan and the European Union wants to show the world that they're still committed to free trade, that they're still working towards free trade, in contrast to Mr. Trump in the US, who has been dragging his feet a little bit on that agenda. So they're trying to sort of to form a front against that.
The EU deal with Canada, CETA, stumbled at the finish line because of opposition from the Belgian state of Wallonia.
Right.
Do you think this EU-Japan deal is going to come up against any opposition? Is it going to be ratified?
Oh, it's certainly going to come up against opposition of that sort. The EU is a conglomerate of different nations and different interests, so there's certainly going to be some kind of opposition. I think it'll be ratified in the end, but there's certainly going to be some bumps along the way, as we saw with Canada. But I'm confident that they'll hash it out in the end.
Negotiators say that it goes much further than an old-style tariff-cutting agreement. How so?
I think what's being referred to here is the technological degrees of harmonization that's built into the deal. So what does that mean? Well, that effectively means that the way the products are produced in Japan and Europe will have to be the same now to some extent after this deal. Also, the regulation, the requirements, product requirements will be harmonized to some extent, which is not normally something you see in a free trade deal. But obviously, in the modern world, when products and especially services are much more complex than they were 10, 20 years ago, when you do a free trade agreement, these particular issues about the fact that if you build a widget in Japan, it has to look the same as in Europe, or it has to be able to do the same things or enter the same market, these kind of small things become very important in modern trade deals. So that's what I think is referred to when negotiators say that it goes far beyond a normal deal.
Klaus, really good to talk to you. Many thanks indeed.
Thank you for having me.
Finally this week, when GCC nations cut ties and severed transport links with Qatar, it prompted fears of food shortages. The country depends heavily on imports, but local farmers are finding inventive ways to soften the impact of the blockade. Laura Burton-Manley reports.
From the outside, there's little sign of life in this barren landscape. But take a closer look, and there's a flurry of activity as staff here double up efforts to fill a vacuum in the market caused by a diplomatic dispute in the Gulf. It's one of just 1,500 farms in Qatar, and it's turning the Saudi-led blockade, which is choking food imports, into an opportunity.
The plan is to add more greenhouses and increase productivity. Usually this is a time to rest, but because of the GCC crisis, we use this opportunity to support the economy and limit the effect of the blockade.
Cucumbers, tomatoes and aubergines have been high in demand from this farm that sells over 45 products. It's clear from the packaging with pictures of Qatar's leader that even the vegetables have become a symbol of patriotism. But growing food in Qatar is not easy. With summer temperatures exceeding 40 degrees Celsius, no natural rivers or lakes and non-arable desert, farmers have to get inventive.
We run a hydroponic farm. The water that feeds the plants has to be drinkable to make grade A produce. This water is continuously reused in our recycling stations.
Now these plants are made with a fertilizer rich in nutrients. You can see here it's made up of a mixture of coconut and volcanic stone. It means they need less water than soil. Now the water is pumped up through an aquifer. It's dripped down through the plants and fed then to the trees outside. This makes a homegrown meal not only possible, but essential for Qatar's food security. But there are other hurdles. Equipment to maintain climate control doesn't come cheap. The government is subsidising farmers to adopt more efficient methods that recycle the most precious commodity in the desert, water.
We're using new technology and methods of irrigation on the farms. We are also helping farmers by subsidizing them and giving them loans with less than 1% interest.
And supermarkets are stocking more produce from Qatari farmers. Although they were flooded with imports from Turkey and Iran, they say there is more of a demand now for locally grown fruit and vegetables. Back on the farm, Abu Germain has little doubt that Qatar can handle this crisis. But to run these farms takes a lot of energy, something Qatar certainly doesn't lack.
Laura Burton-Manley out in the desert, ending our show for this week. If there's anything you want to comment on, something you want to tell us, then please join in the conversation. Follow and tweet me. I'm at A Finnegan. but use the hashtag AJCTC when you do, or you can drop us a line. Counting the Cost at aljazeera.net is our address. There's plenty more for you online at aljazeera.com/CTC. That takes you straight to our page, which has individual reports, links, even entire episodes for you to catch up on. But that's it for this edition of Counting the Cost. I'm Adrian Finnegan from the whole team here in Doha. Thanks for being with us. The news on Al Jazeera is next.